Do you want to know more about how you can eat for better health and longevity, and how your diet and lifestyle can play a part in chronic disease? Then you're in the right place. I'm Claire Day.
And I'm Daisy Lund, and we are both plant-based doctors with a passion for improving nutritional education. In this podcast, we will bring you all the latest medical evidence on how a plant-based diet can improve your health whilst being kinder to the planet and fairer to the animals that we share it with.
Twice a month, we bring you interviews from experts in the field with a focus on an important topic related to plant-based health, all while sharing recipes and food ideas.
So, welcome to, in a nutshell, the Plant-Based Health Professionals podcast.
Hello listeners, and welcome to our first episode of 2024 and the first episode of season 2.
Hello everyone. Hello Claire, how are you? How's your January been so far?
Well, I'm sure it's nothing to do with my plant-based diet, but I've been going into work battling with the winter viruses, so it has actually affected my ambition to run every day in January. I was going to do Red January. But which is where you either run every day or you do some kind of exercise, which sort of counts as going for a run. But I have been out for a run this morning after almost 2 weeks off, and it was fine actually, and almost I would say better after a long rest from exercise. So maybe something I should, take a break from more often. But how are you faring?
I'm all right, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad to hear you're back out there running. That's good. I'm also running. I don't really enjoy the cold, sort of dark evenings in January very much. Definitely more of a summer person, but I've got to stay positive at this time of year. And I've actually been quite mindful about sort of going out in sunlight, so going out during the day. It's obviously difficult if you're sort of working all day, but even if it's sort of 10 minutes at lunchtime, I'm trying to just go out for a walk or something like that in my lunch break. And I think there's some science, isn't there? There's some published evidence about walking in daylight sort of boosting serotonin levels.
We've got all the evidence, haven't we, that walking is good and that light is definitely therapeutic for things like low mood and for people who aren't sleeping well at night. And I have a lot of conversations about this with patients who've actually become, to my mind, a bit nocturnal, and they're unable to break the cycle of sleeping during the day because they haven't slept the night before. But I think it's really good that you've come to this walking plan yourself, Daisy, rather than hearing it from me, because lifestyle advice is quite hard to take on. Yeah. We know this, which is why conversations about lifestyle can be so hard. As we discussed with Gemma Newman, no one likes to be bossed and criticised.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll always take lifestyle advice from you though, Claire, for sure. Anyway, moving on to the episode, we've got a jam-packed one today, haven't we? Not just one, but two amazing guests. And today we're talking all about multiple sclerosis and how diet and lifestyle can have an impact on this condition.
Yes, this week we had the pleasure of hearing from one of our members, Samantha Joseph, a nutritional therapist and a member of the British Association for Nutrition and Lifestyle Medicine, as well as Overcoming MS ambassador, Karen Lee, previously an ITU nurse who now works as a nutritionist and events manager for plant-based health professionals, despite getting a diagnosis of MS in her 40s.
Yeah, for me, Claire, it was a real eye-opener of an episode. And I think I've already mentioned on the podcast, I do speak to my colleagues and patients about the benefits of a whole food plant-based diet when it comes to chronic diseases like diabetes or heart disease. But I didn't really know how diet and lifestyle can affect conditions such as MS. And I probably wouldn't have had the confidence in my knowledge if someone asked me specifically in a consultation. And I hadn't heard about the organisation that we go on to talk about in the episode Overcoming MS.
Me neither. But now we know, and we can say that Overcoming MS is a charity whose aim is to help people with MS live a healthy life through their self-management programme. And what I really love is the clear and practical guidance they give based on the 7 pillars, which we discuss in the episode.
Yeah, I think, once you're diagnosed with a chronic condition and doctors are suggesting prescriptions or treatments, it might feel like you don't have control over what's happening. But organisations like Overcoming MS, they really help empower people again.
Yes. I mean, it's all about feeling part of the decisions and actions around the management of a disease and knowing what you can do as an individual or a family to ensure health and well-being. And I think you can really hear the passion in their voices in this episode, given their personal experiences of the disease.
Yeah, I agree. I really loved hearing not just expert advice, and the medical evidence to support that advice, but also the patient voice and the patient journey in this episode in particular. And I think that's what gives us a greater understanding in our line of work.
Yeah. So shall we have a listen to the interview?
Yeah, absolutely. But before we do, please could we ask a favour from you, our wonderful listeners? Without you, we wouldn't be here recording. So in order to help this podcast grow and help us produce more episodes, could we ask that today you either press the subscribe button and follow us on whichever your chosen platform is, if you haven't done that already,
or send us a rating or a review through the platform,
or share us with a friend.
So these steps will help others find us and help spread the word about the benefits of eating more plants. Hello, everyone. So today we've got 2 for the price of 1. We've actually got 2 guests on the podcast, both experts in multiple sclerosis.
Samantha is a registered nutritional therapist, and she's also a guest lecturer on Integrative Nutrition courses covering modules on multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, mental and behavioural health. In 2018, she joined the charity Overcoming Multiple Sclerosis as a senior facilitator and speaker. She also works with the MS Academy and is working on publishing a paper for the journal Frontiers of Neurology, highlighting holistic management of MS.
Karen Lee, a former intensive care nurse and now registered nutritionist, working as the Sensitive Foodie, running courses, workshops and cooking classes, and has a popular blog, The Sensitive Foodie Kitchen. In 2019, Karen published her first book, Eat Well, Live Well, and is currently working on her second. She is an ambassador for Overcoming MS and has helped to create the Plant-Based Health Professionals Fact Sheet on MS. She was co-author on a case study about whole food plant-based diet and MS published in the American Journal for Lifestyle Medicine. Karen is also events manager for Plant-Based Health Professionals, having recently been instrumental in putting on the fantastic 2023 VegMed conference.
So welcome both. It's great to have you on.
Thank you.
Lovely to be here.
Oh, thanks. Lovely to have you. So starting with you, Sam, can you tell us how you came to being a nutritional therapist with a focus on MS?
Well, it was back in 2002. My husband was diagnosed with MS. And a year or two later, at the time, we were given very little information on how to support him other than going away and waiting until another relapse occurred to then be given an official diagnosis. And it struck me immediately how disarming that was in terms of control and power. And so I went off and did my own research, and I found MS UK, and I found the Best Bet diet and the work of Roy Swank and the idea of low saturated fat. And we started on our own journey. A few years later, I was looking for career change, young family, wanted a career that would fit in around having a young family. And I trained as a nutritional therapist. We were very much into supporting Danny and his MS diagnosis in the house, and very much walking the talk in terms of diet management for MS and what we could do. But I didn't really want to do it with my clients as well. It felt like too much. So I started out originally just as a very broad nutritional therapist, seeing lots of different people with lots of different conditions. But over the years, word sort of spread that I was a nutritional therapist living with MS. And now my practice is mostly populated by people who have MS. And I'm really lucky that I've found this niche where I feel like I've got this expertise, and I've got lived experience, and I've got that extra element to really give the understanding to people in the MS community. Like you said, I was also taken on as a guest lecturer in various brain health modules and in MS as well, and joined the Overcoming MS charity in 2018, really desperate to align myself with them because we were really doing and living, and I was practising and preaching the work and of the Overcoming MS programme.
Brilliant. Can we go back to basics for a few minutes and just sort of explain to listeners who might not know what MS actually is?
Yeah, so MS is an autoimmune, chronic, potentially severely disabling neurological condition that affects people most often diagnosed in their 20s to 40s. That's not to say that people outside of those age brackets aren't diagnosed, but it's more common that in that time of life you would be diagnosed, which can be a very shocking diagnosis with people with careers and family planning. It affects women more often than it affects men. There's around 3 million people in the world who are believed to have MS. And it's really because it affects the central nervous system, the symptoms can be extremely wide-ranging and far-reaching throughout the whole body. So fatigue is one of the most common symptoms, cognitive issues, but then some of those other more sensory issues like tingling that we think of when we think of MS, mobility issues, even mental health issues, weakness, balance. So really, really far, wide-ranging symptoms. And so what's happening is the body's own immune system is auto-attacking. So it's turned in on itself and it's actually attacking the oligodendrocytes, which are the cells in the brain and the central nervous system that actually manufacture and maintain the myelin sheath, which is that insulating layer that allows the very high speed of transmission in the nervous system.
Do we know what causes MS?
Well, there is presumed to be some genetic predisposition, but it's not like we've identified a single gene. I think there's over 240 genes that might be associated with MS. So that suggests that there's definitely environmental factors that are potentially switching on these genes, and things like low vitamin D, geographical location of where you actually live in the world, other things like lifestyle factors or viruses may all turn out to be one of those triggers that switch the genes on that can cause MS in the first place.
Yeah. So I think I remember as a medical student sort of being taught about that genetic susceptibility that you mentioned and the potential for viral triggers. But I don't really remember being taught much about lifestyle as a trigger. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so there's some quite sort of older studies. And I guess because we are where we are now in the present time, we have this sort of retrospective ability to look back and look at the population studies and see where we can see higher incidences of MS and that increased risk. And certain lifestyle factors like smoking are now well understood to pose a risk factor, as well as having a higher body mass index as well. That may also be a factor. High levels of stress, even childhood trauma, have thought to be a lifestyle factor and shown that stress can very often occur just before a diagnosis. A great period of stress can quite often trigger that first incident that leads to a multiple sclerosis diagnosis, as well as exacerbating the condition once you have it. But also, we do have quite a lot of dietary suggestion as well from large-based population studies. MS seems to be more apparent in those countries where diets are higher in meat and dairy, processed oils, processed foods, and much lower in things like fiber and fruit and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and those more healthful foods. So definitely a more westernized diet, and those more westernized industrialized countries seem to have higher rates of MS. There were some older studies that looked at, for example, in Norway, where you would imagine the whole population would have quite similar risk, a similar latitude and a similar risk. They actually noted that there were higher rates of MS more in the more inland communities, where communities would rely more on things like meat and dairy agriculture versus the coastal areas in Norway, where people were eating more fish and potentially getting more vitamin D, more omega-3 from those sources. So there are some very interesting population studies that suggest the role of diet in actually contributing to the cause of MS.
So do we think that the incidence of MS being higher in Western countries is mainly due to diet or other factors?
I think it's that sort of the idea that it's a whole collection of creating the right environment for those susceptible genes to actually be switched on. And diet is something that is absolutely paramount in terms of maintaining the health of individual cells in the body and expression of cells and DNA. So I think that the geographical evidence and the sort of lifestyle links around diet have been, really suggestive that is a key role.
Yeah, I'm going to be really honest here and just be, completely honest about my ignorance with regards diet and how to advise patients who already have an MS diagnosis in my clinic about diet. I don't think diet and MS is often in the same sentence for most doctors, to be honest. So can you tell us a bit more about the aspects of diet that we ought to be speaking about with patients?
Yes, so some of the primary evidence that we have for diet, one of the biggest trials that's been done around diet and MS was actually done in the 1950s by a neurologist, Dr. Roy Swank. This was quite an interesting study. Being done in the 1950s, there wasn't such a thing as a randomized control trial. But what he attempted to do was set up an intervention study. He took 150 people with MS and he put them on a very low saturated fat. He'd been looking at all this epidemiological data around the risk factors for MS in the first place and attempted to address those factors with a very low saturated fat diet. He then followed them for over 34 years. So quite a remarkable study in terms of the length that it went, and actually published his first results in the Lancet in 1990. And what he noted was he asked people to follow a very low saturated fat diet of less than 20 grams a day. The people that managed that, he called the good dieters, and the people that didn't, he called the bad dieters. And what he noticed was that as he followed them over the years, those good dieters had an up to 80% reduced relapse risk in the first year. And when he followed them 34 years later, he found that 95% of the people in the very low saturated fat group were still extremely well and ambulant, compared to only 7% in the group that were the bad dieters, or those that hadn't managed to stick to those very low saturated fat levels. So I think that's really quite clear evidence that controlling saturated fat, which we know is not very good for us anyway, from a cardiovascular point of view, and the kind of levels that he's talking about align with the American Heart Association that recommends 11 to 13 grams of saturated fat for people trying to lower cholesterol level. And people with MS are also at risk of cardiovascular disease. And this is new evidence that's come to light as well. And so it just really amplifies how important this information is, that people with MS, if you're asking, from a GP perspective who doesn't know much about MS and diet, I think the saturated fat element is a really important element and a primary piece of advice for people with MS.
Yeah, but also from a GP perspective, could you just advise a low saturated fat diet? What is it about the plant-based, do you think, that actually helps when you have MS? Is it just that if you eat a diet that's low in fat, and a plant-based diet generally is, that's all you need to do? You just need to cut down on the fats, a bit like some of the low carbs diets that are around for diabetes.
Yeah, so in the last, and it's probably less than 10 years, it's probably the last sort of 5 to 8 years or so, the information and the studies around diet and MS are starting to pick up pace. We still don't have a gold standard for an ideal MS diet, but what is coming through in the literature is that a high quality diet is really important. So this means a diet that, like you say, is very rich in plant foods, plant focused. And automatically, when you're filling your plate with those plant focused foods, you are reducing your saturated fat. So the thing about the plant-based diet is that it has very high levels of antioxidants and polyphenols from all the plant-based foods. Those substances, the antioxidants, can help calm inflammation that's going on throughout the body systemically, but also in the brain. Polyphenols are a great way to nourish the microbiome, which again can help ameliorate inflammation systemically throughout the body, but also including foods that are high in omega-3 as well, because those directly have that anti-inflammatory effect on the body. And that's what we're seeing in the more recent evidence now, that a high quality diet far outstrips the Western standard American diet in terms of supporting someone with MS, in terms of addressing fatigue, reducing disability progression, improving quality of life, and improving overall disease trajectory.
In the Overcoming MS diet, you talk about using flaxseed oil. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, so flaxseed oil is very high in alpha-linoleic acid, and that is one of the powerful omega-3 fatty acids. And what we know from a handful of studies is that people with MS tend to favour the uptake of saturated fat in their diet over other fats. Those saturated fats get into cell membranes. They make cell membranes very rigid. They're very degenerative to the body. They cause inflammation. And in order to address that balance, for people with MS, it's really important to have a very high polyunsaturated fatty acid intake. So to kind of get above and beyond what we might recommend for the regular population, a dose of beneficial omega-3 fats to really sort of counteract that balance. Again, similarly, omega-3s compete with omega-6. So we really want to sort of make sure that we're going sort of heavy on the omega-3s to really be sure that we're getting sufficient amounts and that they're converting properly as well. So on the Overcoming MS program, we recommend 20 to 40 millilitres of flaxseed oil a day. So that's not flax seeds. That's the flaxseed oil. Flax seeds, ground flax, really beneficial in terms of providing some oil, in terms of fibre and lignans, protein, but it's the oil that's so important for people with MS to help to readdress that balance.
And how would you be telling them to actually incorporate that in their diet? I mean, is it something that you take like a medicine, or do you cook with it? What do you do with it?
Yeah, so we never cook with flaxseed oil because it becomes oxidized very quickly and it's quite an unstable oil. So we recommend that you get cold pressed fresh flaxseed oil, as fresh as you can, and keep it in the fridge in a dark glass bottle. And it shouldn't taste bitter at all. It should have a reasonably smooth and nutty taste. There shouldn't be any bitterness. If it's bitter, it's likely rancid, in which case you need to chuck it out. But yeah, we recommend drizzling it onto steamed veggies. So you can put it onto your food once you've cooked it. You can stir it into a warm bowl of soup. You can drizzle it over pasta. You can drizzle it over pasta with sauces. You could add it to smoothies or put it into a soy yogurt. But if some people, and I know some people do, they do take it like medicine, like Mama used to give cod liver oil back in the 1950s on a spoon. I think people do take it as in a kind of medical kind of way, as a spoonful, just to be sure they're getting it. I know my husband for a while used to put it in a little shot of orange juice and whisk it up and just down that in the morning. Yeah, we do think of it as being a supplement, a medicinal extra supplement to the diet.
Sam, I was going to ask you about that because a lot of people are familiar with fish oils commonly, but is there evidence that flaxseed oil is better in MS than fish oils?
Yes, so that's an interesting one. So there's one of the holism studies that was done actually showed that using flaxseed oil, not fish oil, but using flaxseed oil could actually reduce relapse rate by up to 60%. There was also the nurses cohort study looking at more than 17,000 nurses, and they also, through that study, they surmised that flaxseed oil was more protective against MS risk than fish oil. And I think when you're taking the oil as an oil rather than as a capsule as well, you're really aware if there's any rancidity there. Whereas if you take something in capsule form, do you know how long it's been on the shelf? You know, what other contaminants may be in there? And so, yeah, we really believe the magic is in the flaxseed oil.
Right. And thinking about animal products, the MS diet obviously avoids meat and dairy, and the meat part of it makes sense. We've got loads of evidence that meat is bad for things like cardiovascular disease, so you don't want to be adding to any burdens there. But what about milk in particular? What's the evidence around that and the effect on the immune system with an illness like MS?
So there's been quite a few sort of population studies linking high consumption of dairy to a greater risk for the population. There have been some older studies around babies who were fed with cow's milk in bottles at higher risk of getting MS later in life. And when they've looked at the certain proteins under a microscope very closely, some of these proteins like butyrylfolin are very similar in chemical structure to some of the proteins that are in myelin, this myelin basic protein. And the idea is that there is a process of molecular mimicry going on. So if the body's T cells are already primed to be attacking myelin, then when you're consuming dairy, you may well be signaling your T cells to seek out and destroy myelin. More recently, and this year, there were a couple of studies around people with MS were more likely to have an IgG intolerant reaction to dairy proteins as well. And there was another IgA study, reactive study. So people with MS were actually showing an immunoglobulin A, so an IgA reactive reaction to myelin oligodendrocyte glycoprotein when exposed to dairy products. So the evidence is new, and for me, and my husband, it's absolutely convincing enough. And with the vast array of dairy alternatives and the understanding that this is a substance that comes out of a cow and is supposed to nourish its calf, and we are humans, do we really need it? The evidence, although it's kind of very compelling, small in its number of studies, it's definitely sufficient for me, for my patients, for my husband to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, that's brilliant. I've not read those studies, but we will put a link in the show notes so that people can have a look. Would you be able to clarify what the dose is of vitamin D that is recommended? So there's a belief, isn't there, that a high dose of vitamin D is useful in people who have MS?
Yeah. So there, again, the population and geographical studies have shown that low vitamin D definitely appears to be a risk for getting MS in the first place. And then more recent studies have shown interventions by correcting deficient levels of vitamin D that you can actually reduce relapse rate and slow trajectory of the disease. We know, for example, that A&E emergency rooms are much busier in March and April after the long, dark months of winter when people's vitamin D levels are much lower. So all of this has kind of given rise to a number of studies to try and show that there may be a link between correcting deficient levels of vitamin D and ameliorating symptoms of MS. So I know that we usually think about 400 IUs, but the level that we want to give people with MS is way higher than that. And there's some evidence to show that people with MS tend to have more SNPs or polymorphisms on the gene that actually allows you to pick up and use vitamin D in the body, and it's more overrepresented in the MS community. And the idea is that there is a study called the Big Vitamin D Mistake, which is a really great study to have a look at. And that study, along with some others, including the Harvard research team, showed that in order for us to prevent all-cause mortality and indeed to prevent MS, we need to keep our blood levels of vitamin D over 100 nanomoles per litre. So at the moment, I think the recommendations for sort of optimal, I think, are around sort of 70 to 80. But really, we know that that is really more likely over 100. There was a study called the Benefit randomized control study that also showed that having high levels of vitamin D in the blood correlated with low level of disease activity. So based on evidence like this, we aim to keep people's levels at around 150 to 200 nanomoles. And this allows for things like seasonal changes when levels will drop. It allows for disease activity that may well be using up more vitamin D. I think we're using, a good sort of 8,000 IUs of vitamin D every day. If we were running around in loincloths in a hot climate like our ancestors were, we would be manufacturing about 15,000 IUs of vitamin D every day. So the level that we think is optimal to be prescribing to people with MS is in the region of between 5 and 10,000 IUs every day. And that has been shown to be safe, and it has been shown to be sufficient to get levels up to where we want them to be.
Can I ask, Sam, because those are quite high doses for in GP land anyway, is there any advice about monitoring patients' levels? Should we be doing blood tests?
Yeah, I'm so disappointed when I see someone newly diagnosed and they say, I've seen this person, I've been to Queen's Square, I've been, they've seen neurologists, and I say to them, right, and what's your vitamin D level? And they go, I don't know, no one's tested that. And it's so heartbreaking to hear that, because it's a really cheap test. It can be done really easily. And if that person is deficient, there's good evidence to say that if we address that fast, we can make a big impact. And it's just negligent that it's not being done. So I think that anyone who comes into contact with someone with MS should first off ask them, and what's your vitamin D level? Can we test it for you? Also, on the Overcoming MS program, we recommend that people get their levels tested twice a year. And if it isn't something that their GP is willing to do, we signpost them to the private tests that you can do at home and generally cost about 20 to 30 pounds. They're very cheap and easy to do, and you get instant results. And in that way, you can then tweak your vitamin D dose throughout the year in the changing seasons. You may want to be on 5,000 in the summer and 10,000 over winter. And something like the Overcoming MS program is great for GPs who maybe don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of what they should and shouldn't recommend. If they're signposting them to Overcoming MS and they're finding the information there and they're taking responsibility for themselves, then that's a huge worthwhile intervention.
Thank you. You mentioned Overcoming MS a couple of times. So can we hear a bit more about that? Perhaps, Karen, would you be able to tell us a bit more about Overcoming MS and the programme that you're both working within?
Yes. Well, Overcoming MS is a fantastic organisation. I know I would say that, but it is. And it's based on the research that was produced by Professor George Jelinek, who he's retired now, but he was a professor of emergency medicine in Australia who developed MS. His mother also had MS years before as well. And this is basically, he got the diagnosis, he went and to do all the research to find out how to get cured, as it were, and was very surprised that actually the best evidence was what turned out to be the 7 pillars of the MS program. And then the Overcoming MS charity was set up by another Australian lady who is based in the UK. So it's a UK-based charity, but it's worldwide, and anyone can access it. It's it's free online to access, which is fantastic. And there's a couple of really amazing books as well to really help people. The newer one is a little bit easier to read. Some people with a lot of people with MS, as Sam was saying, have cognitive issues. So it can be quite difficult to kind of really get your brain around what's being said, which is where these 7 pillars are really easy to follow. Diet being a key one of them, and then getting enough vitamin D, as Sam's already talked about. Exercise, which is really important. And previously, people with MS were told, well, don't move because you can't move, which obviously was actually one of the worst things. So exercise is really important. So meditation and mindfulness a really key. So basically stress management. Medication is another pillar. So overcoming MS for a while was kind of seen as anti-medication, anti-medical interventions, and it's really not. It's a key part of it if you need to take it or if you choose to take it. And looking after your family, so supporting your family members who might be at risk of developing it. But really, the key one for me is doing whatever it takes, basically, to be as well as you possibly can.
Yeah. So Karen, we've got quite a big question here, really, which is, obviously you're someone who's living with MS. And, when I was listening to Sam talking about the risk factors for MS, and I was thinking, most of these aren't Karen, and because I know that you were plant-based or at least vegetarian before your diagnosis. But can you tell us a bit more about putting the plant-based diet into practice, how it's helped you, and how you came to be an ambassador for the Overcoming MS program?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. Well, yes, it's interesting. So when I did get my MS diagnosis, I was already plant-based. However, I got diagnosed age 47. So I'd done quite a lot of stuff before. So basically, I think I probably had symptoms of MS quite a few years before that. So I was really struggling with migraines. In fact, I'd always had a problem with real bad headaches and all sorts of things my whole life. And I had quite a lot of stress in my life as well. So I was working in neuro ITU, don't do easy ITU. Working in neurosurgical ITU, I had young children, and I was also studying to do my acute clinical practice degree at the same time. So yeah, how to just build up all your stress. And so the headaches were getting a lot worse. So I had enough, and I was also always on a diet because I loved eating. I still do love eating, but I was always enjoying my cakes, my biscuits, cheese, bread, and wine, all of those lovely things. But these migraines were getting worse, and I'd noticed I did a detox diet and I felt so much better. So I thought food. And I discovered just before my 40th birthday that I had a food intolerance. Very interesting what Sam was just saying. I had food intolerances to dairy, big style, and also to yeast. So basically, all of my favorite foods, which I used to love face planting and drinking, were creating a lot of problems. So after my 40th birthday, because you've got to have all your cake on your 40th, don't you? I went dairy free and noticed a huge difference. And then I cut out bread and all of those things as well. But there were still some other odd things going on. But life goes on, and we actually then rather randomly moved to India. So I stopped working for a while. My husband got a work placement out there, and continued being dairy free. And in fact, most of my family went pretty much dairy free out there because the milk was challenging, just because of there's not the same kind of pasteurization and everything that you get here. But anyway, it's another story, long life milks and things. But whilst I was out there, I met this amazing woman called Dr. Nandita Shah, who some people may have come across, who teaches about using food as medicine. I'd also started studying nutritional medicine myself whilst I was out there. And she was teaching about eating a whole food plant-based diet, and I was just like, oh my god, this is amazing. So and we were living in southern India anyway, in Bangalore, so vegetarian food was more readily available, plus the amount and types of vegetables were really interesting. So I went plant-based at that point. So and started developing my own recipes and all of those things, and this is where the sensitive foodie came from. So when we came back from India, I'd already started running some cooking classes for people, because I was really enthusiastic about this. Plant-based, it can heal all sorts of things, and have some nice cake. But also went back to work as well, and I went back into general ITU, which was interesting because I'd always worked in a surgical environment, whether or not it was on a surgical ward or in intensive care. And this was a lot of people with chronic health problems with acute issues, or people with chronic health problems who had surgery and needed extra monitoring. And I was beginning to get this real sort of realization that a lot of people were really stuck and disempowered when they had a chronic health problem. And research shows that whilst we're living longer, as a general rule, the last 16 years of people's lives are in poor health. And a lot of people are really, really kind of trapped. So I was getting this growing realization. But then, so again, still juggling. So notice the stress sign, so I was trying to run my own little business. I was writing, I was working, still had teenage children. I was training to do a half marathon and got picked up some nasty flu virus from a patient. Again, dangers of working in these environments. And then suddenly, over the course of about a week, lost the sight in one of my eyes. And I had really quite interesting experience of optic neuritis, which for a lot of people is one of the first symptoms of MS. And eventually it all came back, got it in the other eye, and then things started to deteriorate slightly. And eventually on my 47th birthday, I had a special birthday treat of a lumbar puncture, which was again very interesting. When you're suddenly on the other side of all of these things, you get a very different experience. And then was diagnosed with MS in March 2016, and was absolutely devastated, to be honest with you. I thought I'd let everybody down, I'd let myself down. I mean, it's crazy what goes through your head. But I'd already been aware of the Overcoming MS program because one of my lovely work colleagues, her husband, has MS, and he was trying to follow the program, and so she'd come to one of my cooking classes. So I went to see her and basically got on board pretty quickly. I did quite a lot of tweaking with with my diet, even though I was eating really healthily, but I'd kind of replaced a lot of the saturated fats with coconut. So because I love desserts and creamy curries, you end up using a lot of coconut milk and things like that. So that had to change quite a lot. And then as Sam was saying about the flaxseed oil, getting in those really healthy omega-3 fatty acids, I have to say it is quite challenging to start because you do learn quite quickly what is a nice fresh bit of flaxseed oil and what is, some of it is just like, oh my God, no, that's terrible. But I did also try medication as well, but unfortunately neither of those worked, and it created other health problems, we think, not sure exactly. So I decided that my neurologist and myself decided that the better route to take was to do whatever I was already doing, which is following the Overcoming MS program and eating a lot of fresh produce. This is my choice. I eat a lot of vegetables and fruit during the day, some raw, some cooked, as well as all the whole grains and beans and lentils. And I chose not to eat fish because on the Overcoming MS program, fish is an option. I chose not to, partly because there's a lot of toxins in fish now, and we also now there's lots of microplastics as well. But I also feel, for my own stress management side of things, is I feel much happier being kinder to the world and to myself. So if I can help myself heal, it's almost like you're passing that on to the world around you as well, which is kind of also why I got much more involved with the Overcoming MS program, because support is really important. When you have this diagnosis, no one understands what you're going through, because why would they, unless they're going through the same thing? And so it's not only dealing with the diagnosis, but trying to do that in a positive way, because some groups, I did try a couple of groups and I just left quite depressed, because I'm quite a proactive person, and I decided I was not going to be one of those disempowered patients. And that's so being part of an organization which is about taking positive action was really important to me. And so when they started setting up the local groups, I offered to be an ambassador, and it was just so lovely to meet people who were following the same program. We inspire each other. Whenever we get together, it's always food related because we all love eating. And so, but for people who are new to the program, it's really helpful because it shows them that they can eat some fantastic food that's really tasty. It's quite simple. We can talk about how it's made. We talk about other things about the program, but difficulties that people may or may not be having. But then also we just talk about life as well. It's just a normal group of people because it's just part and parcel of life. And that's to me, that's the food is integral to it, but it's about living it as well.
Obviously, when you talk about the diet, you really sound like you're living your best life. If you were selling it to other people in the group, you've talked before, haven't you, about some of the wider benefits. So can you tell us a bit more about some of the benefits that you think that someone living with MS would feel when they made this diet switch? Maybe the contrast wasn't as stark for you because it was more of a gradual thing, but can you give us any insight into how differently somebody might feel?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and it's things that a lot of people will feel when they make these changes anyway, even if they're not dealing with MS. So, so it really does have a much broader benefit to people. It's because a lot of the way that when we eat a lot of rubbish food, then we're basically making ourselves a bit rubbish. So because everything, our bodies are just using whatever we fuel it with. So when we are eating sort of healthier fats, like the oils in these lovely omega-3s in flaxseed oil, but also in nuts and seeds and other foods, that's then really getting into our body. So it helps to improve our energy levels. It improves skin health. It does help with cognitive sides of things, and that's variable because some people, it depends where their lesions are in their brain. And this is the other thing with MS, because everybody is so different. You can have a group of people, they're all doing exactly the same thing, but it will have differing effects on them, and that's just part of having MS. So some people respond better to one thing than others, but also just wider things. I think I lost weight. I mean, I don't have to go on a diet anymore, and I dieted for years and years. At school, I don't think I was that fat at school, but I used to be called Granny Flab. Hey. So kids are great, so that weight side of things has already been with me, and now I eat a lot of food, and yet the weight stays pretty stable as long as I don't drift off into the bad side of things. But also, I mean, things like for my age, for women, the menopause, I was dreading it. I really was, because my not into go into any too many details, but my gynecological history isn't fantastic, and even to the point where I was seeing a gynecologist, and she'd say, "Well, for 90% of women, this will happen, but probably not for you." So I was really dreading it, and it's actually been, touch wood, pretty smooth so far with regards to, I do get a few hot flushes and things, but nothing too bad. My mood is pretty stable. I eat a lot of soya products, probably a lot more than other people would say, but I'd have 2 to 3 portions of different things a day. And I make sure that, like, I have tofu that's got calcium in it, so I'm, for my bone health as well. But I just find that just helps to balance things out, so you haven't got all of these swings as your hormones are flying around all over the place in different levels. And I think also because I had a lot of gut issues as well, which I was really aware of, they've really settled down a lot. And again, I'm not going to go into too many details, but I was quite known for being a very windy person. And everybody says, "Oh, when you go vegan, you get really bad wind," and you can do if your gut is overrun with nasty sugars and bad bacteria and all of those things. But over time, as you're eating these fabulous fruits and vegetables and whole grains and all of that, your microbiome does shift, and you're making the friendly guys really happy, and they don't you react so much when you're having, the whole sugars and things. And I just feel so much better for it, and things are much calmer. So yeah, and what I was going to say with that is because gut health is also really, really key to your mental health as well, because of this gut brain axis. And as Sam was saying, a lot of people with MS have mental health issues, whether or not it's dealing with this diagnoses and what the stress and or potential stress of what the future may or may not hold. But also it is a feature of the condition as well, which is only just recently been recognised, but it's a really important thing. And when you've got eating foods that is helping your gut to be better, we know that gut health and brain health, they're linked. And so it just helps your brain to be healthy as well, and then cuts down on a lot of comorbidities. But there's just something when you're eating this way and living this way, you just know that you're doing whatever you can. And there's something really positive about that. Even when things aren't perfect, there is something just really positive about that. Last MRI scan I had, and they actually said my lesions are, not only have I got no active disease, the no disease activity is what they say, isn't it? Is that my lesions are smaller. So, they're still there, but they're just chilling out and hopefully not causing too many problems, which is great news.
That is great news, Karen. Going back to the gut microbiomes, I know that's an area that's increasingly popular in terms of medical research and what we're finding out about the gut microbiome. And Sam, I heard you speaking about gut permeability in MS before. Could either of you talk a bit about the research or the evidence that we have already about the gut and MS?
Yeah, well, so what I'm aware of really with the guts of people with MS is that they tend to be more likely to be dysbiotic. So by that we mean, the unpopular, unbeneficial, more pathogenic strains of bacteria are more overrepresented in people with MS, particularly the species that actually feed on the gut wall and can actually create gut permeability. And there are links with gut permeability and autoimmune conditions as well. It's fairly well documented in autoimmunity that gut hyperpermeability is definitely a feature, and it encourages the immune system to become overreactive to certain foods and proteins that cross. But there are also links between the tight junctions in the endothelial layer of the gut and also the tight junctions in the blood-brain barrier endothelial layer as well. And there's some suggestion that a leaky gut may also cause those other tight junctions in the blood-brain barrier to become leaky. And really a leaky blood-brain barrier is one of those first mechanisms by which the onslaught happens from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system, where those activated T cells can cross and cause all of that damage to the myelin and cause neuroinflammation.
One of the things that to me that makes kind of logical sense is that meat is rotting flesh. That's once something dies, it starts breaking down, and well, even they hang these meats for 28 days and say it's really good, but that's been hanging around for 28 days. So, and those bacteria, even after cooking, they're not all killed. It's the same with dairy. There's an acceptable level of pus left over in milk, and so all of those things are still ending up in your gut, even though it goes through the stomach, and in theory the acid in the stomach's strong enough to get rid of them. But bacteria have been around way before anybody else, then they're very good at surviving. So you put all of those in there and they will overwhelm the good guys. And so so you can kind of see how these things just build up over a period of time.
Absolutely. I think it's very well known now that fruits, vegetables, whole grains and nuts and seeds and legumes will actually feed the good bacteria. But is there any evidence or any studies that you're aware of using sort of more fermented foods and those sorts of foods to help in MS? I mean, it's just a thought. I was wondering if...
No, not specifically for fermented foods. But definitely fermented foods are recommended because those are where we're getting the actual good bacteria to populate the gut in the first place. And the reason we want the good bacteria is because of the metabolites that they make. And as they're busy, working away and working on the food and the prebiotic food and digesting all those delicious polyphenols and things that we're giving them and all that sort of wide variety of plant foods, they're making lots of lovely breakdown products, mainly the short chain fatty acids, which are the ones that can actually, through the gut-brain axis that Karen mentioned, can actually cross a blood-brain barrier and actually have a dampening effect on inflammation in the brain. There was a study done this year where they're trying to take one of these breakdown products, the short chain fatty acid lactate, and create a probiotic supplement that could provide the lactate that could then cross the blood-brain barrier.
So what I wanted to ask in particular is, I'm sure that lots of people listening to this, they might be healthcare professionals, they might be thinking something like the Overcoming MS program, how widely promoted is it conventionally? So would a patient with MS already have been told about this several times by their MS nurse? Or is it something that's a little bit outside of conventional side of things? And then the second part of my question is, if you are a GP or maybe just a well-meaning friend or family member, how would you suggest bringing this kind of lifestyle topic up, with something like the Overcoming MS program, or even just talking about the plant-based diet?
Yeah, okay. That second question I think is really, really pertinent. So for the first half, with regards to how widely is it shared, I think it's improving, I think is the answer. I think as there's more evidence, health professionals are feeling more comfortable with sharing that information, although a lot of it just depends upon where you live and what the general, who your neurologist is and what the local MS nurses are allowed to say, and the environment that they work in. So I think it's changing. I know that Overcoming MS, we're doing webinars and sessions with neurologists and MS nurses at various different conferences and things as well. So I think that it is getting more widely accepted. The Overcoming MS now also partnering more with the MS Society, and they're beginning to share more information about that. So I just think it's just becoming more accepted. It takes time to permeate into the mainstream, particularly within the UK. Different countries work different ways, but I think in the UK we tend to be a little bit more cautious, maybe. I think that might be the nice word to say. I mean, I know where I was living, a couple of the MS nurses were sharing Overcoming MS with their patients, but that's basically because they were friends of mine and they were ex-colleagues. So we've talked about it quite a lot and they've seen the effects. Whereas within the hospital environment, those conversations were less forthcoming, I think, is how I'm going to very politely describe that.
Can I add to that as well, that I think the medical profession is a little bit nervous because it may not be something that they're completely comfortable with. It certainly wasn't part of their training. It's very new. And I think that sometimes undermines their confidence in wanting to do more for their patients. But that it's come through in a few studies that the MS community are a fairly proactive bunch and they want to know what they can do to help their own trajectory. And I think that having an organization like Overcoming MS that really offers a very easily accessible framework and structured prescriptive introduction to really what is basically lifestyle medicine, and very similar to the basic pillars of lifestyle medicine, for health professionals to just direct patients that they've heard about this charitable organisation with lots of resources online. It doesn't need to be anything more supportive of the charity themselves than maybe just gentle signposting. It's there if people want to find it.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll put a link in the show notes as well for people who do want to explore it further.
Well, and hopefully that will become mainstream, because, you know, when I was diagnosed, I was told, oh, have a look at the MS Society website, have a look at the MS Trust website. So hopefully, and then it will be, have a look at that. But the with regards to the second part of the question, which was, you know, how do you approach people about it? I would say carefully, because like I say, when I felt I'd done something wrong when I got my diagnosis, and I felt really devastated, and, you know, and I let people down, and it took time for me to come to terms with all of that. So, whilst I definitely wanted to do things, if you've got someone in that point, it's about giving them the message of hope. You know, there are things that can, don't worry, there are things that you can do. It's not all doom and gloom kind of message, rather than saying, well, if you'd eaten more vegetables and you'd done this and you'd done that, you know, then you wouldn't be in this state. So it's more about, you know, it's great, there are things that you can do, and as Sam said, then pointing them in, you know, have you heard about the Overcoming MS? You might want to have a look at the website. I mean, the organisation, they do regular webinars. There's the local groups. They haven't done conferences yet post the pandemic, but they did some great conferences before. They do retreats. They've just started doing the retreats again. So there's lots of different ways that people can find out about it. So yeah, it's just sort of, there are things that you can do, rather than you should be doing all of this. And then they can pick up the framework, and doing something is better than doing nothing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful. You know, I've got a couple of patients even in mind where I've got no idea if they've heard about this, and I don't want to come across as somebody coming in with, you know, once they've already probably studied things like the risk factors for themselves and wonder why that has happened to them, to then come in with a load of quite drastic changes for, you know, for many people, because this is not how most people are living their lives. Right. We're going to wrap things up there, but we're not going to let you go until you have answered a question for us. And that is, as both nutritional therapists, what are you having for dinner tonight?
Well, for me and for us, Friday night is roast night. And at the end of the week, we keep it simple. I like the tray bakes. So I don't know if you've heard of Ashley Madden, but she's got a great plant-based cookbook. She's got 2 now. And she's actually a lady with MS who's following the Overcoming MS program. And all her recipes are compliant with the Overcoming MS program. So they are all plant-based, and they are all low in oils and added fats as well. And so she's got a really easy tray bake recipe for tempeh. I'm not sure what she calls it, something like midweek. I call it tempeh tray bake, but it's delicious, and it's really just, I don't really know many ways to use tempeh, so this is why I like this recipe. So you just chop it up. I'm going to put in a bit of butternut squash. I'm going to put in some green beans. I will put in some leeks, and then she makes a lovely dressing with like miso and tamari and some almond butter and things that keep it all lovely and moist and a little bit kind of sticky as well. And we'll just have that with some brown rice and probably some greens, like some Swiss chard or something.
I'm so glad you mentioned tempeh, because I've been feeling a lot of guilt about how we've talked about tempeh on the podcast. And it was only recently that I was looking, as part of a sort of cancer care course that I'm doing, I was looking at Deedon Varrell, one of the dietitians, saying that, you know, when you go from tempeh to tofu, you reduce the nutrients by about 50%. I'm not sure what nutrients, hopefully not the protein, but then I said to myself, I need to incorporate tempeh more into food, and we need to promote it on the podcast because it is such a fantastic food. So thank you for that one. What about you, Karen?
So, well, I'm actually, I need to make some space in the freezer. So, I've got some, a nice lentil mix, which is I stuffed in some marrow rings, in a big box. So we're having stuffed marrow rings tonight. and with some baked potatoes, because I don't know, at the minute I've got a thing about baked potatoes. And I live a mile and a half from this amazing farm shop, and they grow all their vegetables in the field behind it. And I've got some fabulous purple kale, which I will probably, well, I was going to say stir fry it, but without oil, obviously. Stir fry that with a little bit of garlic as well. And it's all just made my mouth water, so it'll be good.
Is it a homegrown marrow?
No. We've only moved into this house in July, so my husband's built my vegetable raised beds, but I haven't got anything homegrown. No, but it is an organic one that was bought down at the market in town, so it was gorgeous.
Oh, sounds lovely.
It has been a really fascinating episode. Thank you so much, ladies, for all your insights, and thanks for coming on.